In this section, we're going to be taking a look at some of the new styles that you can apply using CSS3. Now, I've already got my working files open to Chapter 5, and we can go ahead and open up the first document, Try CSS3. Like usual, I'll open it up in my browser, and I'll go ahead and open it up in my TextEdit application as well. And the first thing we want to do is talk a little bit about CSS3 itself. It's built on top of CSS2, and that means it includes all the features. So if you've already been working with it, you can use everything you've used before. Like HTML5, CSS3 is still in a draft state, so none of the features are finalized. And that means that many of the features won't work in every browser you try it in. Now for these lessons, I've been using the Firefox Release 13 browser, and all the features that I'm going to be showing you are working fine in this one. So if you're using especially an Explorer browser to go through these lessons, you may want to go ahead and download and install Firefox to make sure this lesson works right for you. Now you can see, like normal, our file's pretty simple. So let's go over to our code and we'll see if we can add some new styles to it. The first thing I'd like to start with is nice and simple, and we can make use of it right away, and that is a drop shadow. Now we've used drop shadows on websites before, but previously to HTML5, what we had to do is take an image of the item that we wanted to have a drop shadow made for, go into some graphics program, maybe like Photoshop, and actually create the drop shadow there. And then we would crop the image and export it, including the drop shadow. Now that's not too bad, you still get a drop shadow on your images, but it was very tedious on sites that had a lot of images, or what if you wanted to use the drop shadow on something else, like just a plain div? Well, with the new CSS3 box shadow property, we can use it on any block element inside of our HTML5 document. So let's try it out on this red square here. Now, if I take a look in the code, you can see that we've just got a plain div down here with a class of red square, and we've got some styles already dropped in to set some things up for us. Notably, with the red square, we've got a background color that's setting it red, and it's got a width and height property so that we can see it displayed as a block element. Now I do have a couple of other items here, an image and a paragraph, but both of those are set to display none for right now, so we're not seeing them on the page, and we'll work with them a little bit later. If we want to add a drop shadow, let's just go up to the existing red square class and let's add a property line. The property name that we're looking for here is box-shadow. And we set it up just like any other property with a semicolon. This property has several values that you can use with it, but two of them are absolutely required, and that is the horizontal and vertical distance that we want the shadow to drop. I'm going to measure mine in pixels, so I'm just going to set up a pretty big drop shadow with 10 pixel on the horizontal component, and then I'll add a space and add 10 pixels for the vertical component of the drop. We'll end it with a semicolon. Let's save our changes, and let's go see what that does to our div. And there we can see our drop shadow dropped right behind our red div box. Now, just to make sure that we know we're controlling this shadow, I'm just going to go back here and change one of the parameters. The first value was the horizontal offset of the drop shadow, and I set that to 10 pixels just like the vertical one. Let me just change that to 20 so that we can verify that we'll see the difference. I'll save my change, we'll go out, and now you can see that the drop shadow is over 20 pixels and down 10, so we're independently controlling each one of those measures. Now I did mention we have a few other values, and these other values will let us control how the shadow looks. For instance, the first value will let us get rid of this sharp edge. Now that looks like a very bright light shadow, but a lot of times we want them to be a little bit more diffuse or soft edged. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back in and add another parameter to our box shadow property. After the horizontal and vertical components, I can add an amount of blur. Now this blur is measured in pixels just like the first two items, so I'll put in, let's say, 10 pixels of blur. We'll save our changes, and let's go see how that affects our drop shadow. When I refresh, you can now see that soft edge. Now, of course, if you increase that blur amount, you'll end up with a much softer edge, and if you decrease it, you'll sharpen things up. And as we saw, if you leave it out completely, the default value selected for this is 0. So we'll be back to the sharp edge again. Now that's just one of our properties. Another parameter allows us to take the shadow and make it a little bit more 3D. We'll do that by adding a spread value, and that goes right after the blur. So let's go back in here and we'll set up a box shadow spread of, let's say, 20 pixels. Again, you can see I've got a pixel measurement, and what spread's going to do is it will either increase or decrease the size of the shadow, kind of making the light source looking either closer or further away. Now, by adding 20 pixels of spread onto this, the shadow should be bigger than the original shape by 20 pixels all around. So let's just save our changes, and we'll go back and see what that does. When we refresh the page, there you can see that the shadow's kind of grown, and it's right up to the edge over here when we moved it over 20 pixels. So we can see the measurement is just about right. Now you can use negative numbers there as well. I'll change this to a minus 20 pixel spread. We'll save our changes. And now when I refresh the page, the shadow's so small it's almost tucked right behind the element. But if I just increase the value of the horizontal and vertical offsets, we should be able to see it again. I'll save that change. We'll go back and refresh it. And there we can see a much smaller shadow than the original image. And by pushing it out 30 pixels, we can now see it pushed out over the edge. You can use negatives for the other values too. Let me go back and set something else up. First, let me just change the spread to just a positive 2 pixels so that our shadow will be just a little bit bigger than the original square. And what I'll do here is I'll make the first number a minus 30 pixels. Now remember, that was the horizontal offset. So let's save that change. We'll go back, refresh the page, and now you can see that the shadow's pulled off of the left-hand side. There's our minus 30 value. And obviously, using different offsets, we can make the light source and the shadow look like it's coming from different directions. Now back in our code, we can see that we have a lot more control over how this shadow is going to look so far. We can control the offset in both positive and negative values. You can set up the blur, and you can use a negative value here, but it might work strangely in some browsers or not at all. And then, of course, we have the spread. Now we've got two more properties that we can add on to this. And the first one is probably the one that you're going to use most, and that is the shadow color. By default, you can see that black is selected for the color, and that's pretty good for a shadow, but generally I find it a little bit too dark. We can specify the color any way we want, so I'm just going to put that in as my next property past the spread property, and I'm just going to use the simple color name gray. That way I don't have to mix up a special color or anything. Let's save this change. We'll go back out to our document and refresh the page, and now we're getting something that looks a little bit more like a lighter, soft, diffuse shadow of our original div. Now this set of properties is what you'll probably use most often when you're creating drop shadows. You can see that there's a lot of elements in there, so you will have to kind of remember the order to make sure you put the right property in the right place. There is one more property that we can add onto the end that will also affect the look of the shadow, and this allows me to create an inset shadow. Now, this will create a shadow that looks like it's inside the box instead of outside of it. And to use this property, all we do is call off the name of the property, which is inset. I'll add it right at the end, and this is one of those Boolean properties that we use inside of our CSS styles. It's basically on or off. If we leave the inset property out, it will be set to false or off. And if we simply add it, it'll turn it on. So let's see what it does. I'll save my changes. We'll go back out and refresh the page, and now you can see that the shadow looks like it's inside the box projecting onto the element, and none of the shadow's going outside at all. Now you can do some interesting things with this. For instance, let me do a couple changes to our box shadow as we have it right now. First of all, I'll take the horizontal and vertical offset components and make them both 0. Just like any other CSS property, I don't have to specify pixels when I'm specifying a 0 amount. Now I'll leave the blur at 10 pixels, but I'm going to set the spread back to 20 pixels, so once again, our shadow is a little bit bigger than the original object. Let's save those changes, and we'll go back out and see how it looks. Now by setting my shadow right with no offset, you can see it's centered right up with the pixels, and you can see that my shadow is a little bit bigger than the edge of my object. But since it's an inset shadow, it's actually making the red edge a little blurry there. Well, I'll just do one last thing. I'll change the gray color to a white color that matches our background. Let's save that change. And I'll come back and refresh the page. And what it looks like I've made is a soft edge div square. But really, it's just a div with a soft shadow inset onto it. Now you can change around these properties and get all kinds of different effects. But the other thing I wanted to try with this file is we can use it on other block elements. So that's why I have the image and the paragraph down here at the bottom. Let's just go up and modify those two styles. For the image, first of all, I'll get rid of the display none and replace that with a box shadow. Now for the properties on this one, I think I want to make a pretty normal shadow. So I'll just set it to a horizontal and vertical offset of 10 pixels each. I want it to be nice and soft, so I'll set the blur to the same value of 10 pixels. And I don't want any spread, but since I want to change the color from the default, I'm going to add a spread value of 0. Now that makes it easier for me to read and for the browsers not to get confused. And after that, I'll simply add in the color that I want to use, which will just be gray again. I'll set up a semicolon at the end, and what I'd like to do is use this exact same shadow on our paragraph as well. So you can see I've got a paragraph style already in here. Since it's going to be the same, I'll just copy it from the image, and we'll get rid of that display none again, paste it into our paragraph, and save our changes. And when we go back to the browser and refresh the page, there we can see our image and our paragraph have been added at the bottom. And now both of them have really nice stylish drop shadows added as well. Of course, you may want to set up some margin settings on the paragraph or simply embed it inside of a div and set the shadow like we did on the first object.